The Red Web, Chapter 17, Loggerheads.
Blythe had made a mistake. Or rather, he'd made a gamble, and it hadn't paid off. The big boss of the Brass Bangers, the Goliath gang that he'd joined, Tharg, well, he was a big deal. Running a crew of hundreds, his lieutenants had crews as big as most gangs Blythe had known back in Minerva Prime, making him a formidable foe. He was also, Blythe reckoned, able to see the writing on the wall. This is where the gamble had come in. Taking on a gang leader is hard. The split loyalties tear groups apart, and they never are the same afterward. So Blythe had hoped that if he intervened with the leader, persuaded him, that they could avoid the kind of bloodletting that was common in those situations. It was not meant to be. Blythe, of course, knew better than to approach the man directly. Instead, he sent two respected gang members who'd fought with Tharg for years to negotiate with the mountain of a man. They'd offer him the position of cadre head, the elected leader of a cell of workers. He could go along with the revolution and have a place in building the hive afterward, or he could have civil war. His answer was tossing both the men out of a window, falling over 100 feet to die instantly on the factory bulkhead below. His choice was made. He angrily called a moot with all of his lieutenants, wanting to get to the bottom of this treachery. Blythe now had to implement a backup plan. At the gang moot, he would directly challenge Tharg for leadership of the gang, in the hopes of unifying the Brass Bangers behind the uprising. He got support from several of the gang's champions for his challenge, and in the very factory chamber where his representatives had been dashed on the ground, Blythe stood. He knew about half the gang's leaders well enough to count on them to support his claim, but he was reasonably sure that even the most hostile wouldn't try to override a challenge to the death. They all stood at attention, not wanting to give Tharg an excuse to single them out. Anyone could be made an example of when the roided-out madman who'd killed his way to the top was heated, but there was no sign of the brood. Instead, they all stood in silence. Blythe checked the time and was surprised to see the big boss was now late. Very unusual. Before long, a murmur broke out as the strange circumstances became clearer to everyone. Worried, Blythe broke from the lines and started back into the heavy machinery of the factory floor, several others following. The PA barked to life. "Ah, my family, my blood. Is this what we've become? Snivelling traitors, treacherers. I don't know how deep the rot goes, but you've all turned a blind eye to it, even if you haven't defied me yourself. Sadly, the sentence for all is death, because I can't trust any of you to be free from this corruption. Die now, for the glory of House Goliath to live on." By the final words, lasgun fire ripped through the building with plasma shots peppered among the beams. The champions dove to the ground, crawling towards nearby cover, but within moments a dozen were dead on the ground. A stream of Vansar poured through the back entrance, with the imposing figure of Tharg coming in last. "Take them all! Purge the traitors to Lord Elmar!" Blythe hadn't considered this. He knew a challenge was a risky move, but he didn't think Tharg would be so desperate as to clear out his entire leadership. No one was that mad, right? The Vansar were another unexpected wrinkle. They'd been doing business with Byron's crew for some time now, but the two gangs were at best disrespectful to each other and had fallen to blows on a number of occasions. Must not have been hard to get them to be the triggermen, Blythe thought, and if they were successful, the rest of the gang would think the champions had been killed single-handedly by their leader, an impressive feat. It was, by Goliath standards, a remarkably clever response to the situation, and Blythe cursed that the man had been so stubborn. A good tactical mind was a terrible thing to splatter on the pavement. The resilience of a Goliath is a remarkable thing. In fact, gangs that fight them often learn quickly not to count on an injured fighter going down. They always make sure they're dead before moving on. In the flurry of fire, however, the Vansar weren't confirming kills. They were unloading, and the trouble with hotshot modifications is, while the laser might be able to kill Goliath, the gun is prone to overheating and malfunction. As the Vansar ceased firing to analyze the battlefield, there was an immediate response. Pistols firing from multiple directions, the factory machinery lighting up with reflected muzzle flare, bullets found flesh and blood, and in an instant it was a fair fight, the Vansar taking several casualties. Tharg screamed and held up his grenade launcher, lobbing frag shells into the dark. The Vansar were disciplined, forming a fire team and covering each other while searching for the handful of survivors. The Goliaths had only surprise on their side, and two of their numbers fell quickly as their hiding places were discovered. Blythe saw the opportunity to handle Tharg, waiting for the fire team to get deeper into the factory before charging the enormous man, a grenade arcing over his shoulder and exploding with enough force to send him stumbling. Tossing his grenade launcher aside, Tharg raised an enormous toothed axe and revved the motor, bringing the tool of death down where Blythe should have been. But Blythe rolled out of the way and stuck a fighting knife into the man's boot. Screaming in pain, he swung the renderizer down again, catching Blythe in the shoulder, digging into his bone, and sending a hot spray of gore onto Blythe's face. Blythe screamed, the adrenaline driving him to keep fighting even though a similar blow would have killed a normal human. He drew his combi pistol and fired a plasma shot point-blank upwards. Tharg's body collapsed in a moment. On top of him, a charred, bloody mess. Moments later, as the room spun, Blythe saw the black, overcoated forms of Delac fighters entering the factory. Gunfire started as they put the rest of the Van Sar down. One crouched next to him, administering a med gel to close the horrific wound in his shoulder. I think you might be able to keep the arm, comrade. Rest now. An injection of painkillers came a moment later, and everything went dark.